Oh,
Nice to meet you.
you too.
Okay, we're just going to get started with our session. And our topic today is on the application of Vygotsky's philosophy to the online classroom. We're looking at a few aspects of his pedagogy. So to start off with, we'll just introduce ourselves, of course, and then we'll look at Vygotsky in a bit more detail. We'll look at the definitions that we have of online learning, because basically we're looking at how our teaching changed under COVID circumstances. And we're just going to focus on scaffolding, modeling, and student-centeredness, which are the pedagogies that we've been applying in our teaching. And we have included some reflections of what happened to us, with the switch from face-to-face to online teaching. Essentially, Gina and I and Carmela, who can't attend today, have been teaching international local students in humanities, science, business, education, law, and in pathway programs. And after we go through the discussion there, we'll sort of suggest some recommendations as well. So to get started, I'm just going to introduce myself. My name is Annie Best Desierto. I teach at Curtin University of Technology in Perth, Western Australia. I've been teaching for over 20 years. I've also taught at the University of Western Australia and Edith Cowan University, and overseas as well, and in the Eastern States, that's in Sydney. And my areas of teaching are mostly in the humanities, including criminology, Indigenous education. At the moment, I'm also teaching Indigenous science and STEM, which is a new integrated unit for us at Curtin Uni, and also teaching on the enabling programs, which is on the pathway programs for bridging students, to get into their degrees. And I'm going to pass it on to Gina.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gina. I'm colleagues with Annabeth. I've been teaching for about 10 years now. Primarily, I teach at Curtin University. I do enabling programs, so I do academic writing and communications, but I also teach a couple of business units at the university itself. Back to you, Annie.
Thanks, Gina. Okay, to start off with, we've just done a very brief lit review of Vygotskian philosophy, and as people might be aware, if you're interested in Vygotsky, his theory and his philosophy is to do with the learner progressing themselves in line with the social environment as well. So learning occurs in the context of what's around the learner, not just within the learner himself or herself. And according to Murphy, 1997, these are some of the aspects or elements of Vygotskian-based pedagogy. I've highlighted some of the parts here that are related to our discussion today, essentially with scaffolding, modeling, which has to do with apprenticeship learning and authentic assessments. That would be part of modeling. And then with student-centered teaching, which involves, previous knowledge construction of the students, as well as goals for the classroom that are directed at the students' needs for the students themselves. Providing the students with some control of their own learning is part of student-centeredness. And of course, knowledge collaboration is involved in student-centeredness, in modeling, and in scaffolding. Now, with scaffolding, we probably already know what that's about. We know that it's about breaking down a task into simpler steps for the learner, providing them with some guidelines so that the whole task becomes more manageable. As Rasmussen has explained in 2001, it's a form of support for the development of the learner. And sorry, somebody? No. And it is the way teachers or peers supply students with the tools they need in order to learn. That's with Jacobs 2001. I'm sure that some of you will be quite familiar with scaffolding when you're teaching. The thing about scaffolding is it's based on Vygotsky's social cultural psychology, particularly his theory of the zone of proximal development. Now, the zone of proximal development has to do with the part of the learner's competence where they're just about to move into another level of competence. So as the teacher, it would be our role to try and equip and push that student through to the next level. The other thing about scaffolding is it's been identified in the literature as instrumental for students adopting a deep approach to learning. Deep approach to learning, that means that the student is not just using memorization and rote learning. The student is being transformed, becoming creative, creating their own knowledge at the same time as well. Okay, moving on. The next aspect of our discussion today has to do with modeling. I'm sure we are familiar with what modeling is about. It's obviously teaching the students by providing them with some ways they can observe, something they can observe in terms of materials, especially with behavior. And actually, modeling is the way most people learn, right? Instead of depending on the effects of our own actions to inform us on what to do, we tend to observe others, to learn and model on others for our behavior and our thoughts. It's supposed to be one of the most effective ways of the learning of any new skill or knowledge. Finally, with student-centered teaching, obviously that means that our curriculum, our program, the way we teach, we have the needs and the backgrounds of the students considered. And one of the studies done by a fellow called Kemba, where he analyzed 13 studies on lectures approaches to teaching, it was found that the least effective of the approaches of university teachers was that one where they just impart information, purely transfer information. Yeah, they don't basically pay any attention to the student very much. The student is just a vessel, you know, like into which you can pour knowledge. And the other least effective approach is the transmission of structured knowledge, which is very similar to the first one, except that the information is transferred in a clear, logical, and simplified manner. However, the needs of the students and their backgrounds and their previous knowledge are not taken into consideration when teaching. So student-centeredness obviously would include goals for the teaching that are student-directed, incorporating multiple perspectives of all the students in the class, providing them with authentic activities and contexts, providing them with some control over their own learning. So far, we've looked at the three aspects of pedagogy, or three types of pedagogical approaches, rather: student-centered teaching, modeling and scaffolding as based on Vygotskian philosophy. And now I'm going to pass you on to Gina.
Hi, so we're going to look at how we defined online learning, especially during the periods of COVID last year. So for the purpose of this presentation, we have defined it into three groups. The first group is fully online A. So this is independent learning, course materials provided online, there's discussion board participation. However, there is no collaboration, no WebEx or no Zoom sessions. For the B classification, everything's the same, except that now they coupled it with supporting collaborate sessions, Zoom sessions, WebEx sessions. For classification C, we find that everything's the same, except that when it comes to that supporting collaborate sessions, it's selectively given, particularly around assessment periods where they feel that students need more understanding. They will have a collaborate or a Zoom session just to aid at that particular situation. So we looked at the three of us and we looked at how we approached it pre-COVID and when COVID started in March last year. So Annie Beth had 4 classes face-to-face. I had the same for my business students, and Carmela had the same for her legal students. She had 2 face-to-face classes going for 3 hours. And then the moment we had COVID hit in March and everything had to go online, all of us ended up moving all our classes online. Annabeth and I kept our classes kept at the 2-hour class time, but for Carmela, that timing actually dropped to 2.5 hours instead of 3. We all use the B classification, where we had independent learning, course materials online, and as well as supporting Collaborate and WebEx sections to support the learning itself. Next one, Annabeth.
Yes.
So just to look at some of the best practices we tried to introduce for modeling. So I found that when I was trying to model, it was really easy to do, or much more easier to do when it was a face-to-face class. I could observe my students, they could watch me, they had opportunities to seek clarification, to confirm their understanding, and I had opportunities to modify how I modeled theories and concept and examples based on how well they engaged with what I was doing to create that better understanding. However, when COVID hit and we transferred back online, it was really difficult. We transferred when we were in week 4 of semester, and we have a 14-week semester. So really at the beginning of the whole semester. And we didn't have that strong rapport yet between student and teacher. The students were not familiar with the technology. They didn't know how to use Collaborate. They were a bit shy to turn on their mics and turn on their cameras to be seen. They didn't know how to use the functions. People had logging issues. They were popping in and out of the rooms a lot, quite disruptive to the lesson. And I found myself talking to myself for 2 hours, every lesson, trying very hard to get the students to be engaged. And one of the things I had to do was modify my lesson plan. I had to look at how I was approaching it. So I decided that I was going to demonstrate how to use Collaborate every lesson, just a little mini workshop all the time. Remember to press this button, look here, right there, kind of thing, just to get them familiar and comfortable with the system. I gave them opportunities to play with certain functions as well. And I found myself leaning more towards YouTube clips and other research materials to emphasize points that I could have easily done in person, but when you're not there physically, you need other things to help you emphasize that point itself. When it comes to the student-centeredness, which was Carmela's next slide, she found that she also relied heavily on face-to-face contact. She could look at the students, draw on their nonverbal cues. She could kind of regroup them if needed be and provide them with additional support. She did find that the moment we went online and she couldn't see her students, it was really difficult to engage with them. Students are also not using the technology well. The technology either didn't work or they were reluctant to turn it on. When she had them in breakout groups, they either would not participate or she would lose them along the way. They would be sort of logged in and not there really, or they would just log out and go away anyway. So she didn't have that contact. She also found it really hard to sustain the normal class period of 3 hours. How do you fill up that time, and especially in an online environment? So she tried to get them engaged, getting them to read the slides and participate, but there was that sense of, it felt a bit superficial in some ways, and the students just didn't quite engage. So I think we're finding that, we might have to adjust the approach, especially since we are now on an online platform. Annabeth?
Yes. So in terms of scaffolding, well, before COVID, with my face-to-face classes, it was quite straightforward. You have students' questions in class, particularly when they're preparing for their major assessments, and it's a lot easier to discuss with them how to do their preparation tasks and to show them how to do it. It was a lot easier how to show them how to break down their assessment task questions. It was a lot easier to provide a direct evaluation for them on the progress of their preparation for their major assessments. Basically, you could just work with them on the materials and support them step by step towards their final outcomes. Because, you are there and they're there and you're face to face. Obviously, with the onset of COVID, and we had to move to fully online classes, it became much less possible to support my students in the same way in terms of scaffolding as it was with the face-to-face mode. We could only communicate online, and my students had limited access to technology, and also many of them were not willing to be online because they said they had purposely chosen the face-to-face mode of study because they learned best that way, kinesthetically, they had not chosen online study mode. They preferred to, talk directly with the teacher, interact and engage with the teacher and their peers face to face. So really, the kind of support I could provide in terms of scaffolding was limited by the technology as well. I couldn't answer, students' questions in this short space of time that we had online. Whereas if you had a whole class facing you and they would ask you questions, you could field the questions, and you could make sure that everybody basically had answers and everybody had some form of support, when you're facing them. Now, when you're online, you only have the chat box, or you have the audio. And also, many of my students did not have working audio, so that was problematic. So what would normally take a short space of time took much longer in terms of helping them out. So with the switch to online mode, many of my students reduced their class participation, and some of them completely dropped out of class, unfortunately, for the duration of that semester when we were online. Yes, and anyway, to get to our summative conclusion based on the reflections that Gina and Carmela and I made about our experiences applying Vygotskian practice to our teaching online. This is what Carmela has said. Gina, did you want to start off with that one?
Yep. So she's pretty much said that it is quite difficult to apply student-centeredness in an online class because a lot of it has to do with participation, and because she didn't really get a chance to know her students, she found it a lot more challenging. So COVID didn't help the situation as much, but also the online environment makes it a little bit harder to practice student-centeredness. For myself, when it comes to modeling, I found that you couldn't directly apply traditional classroom setting, modeling in traditional classroom settings to an online environment. The dynamics was completely different. If you want to use modeling for an online environment, you do have to have modifications put in to suit the learning environment and to suit also the student cohort that you actually have. Annabeth?
Yes, and it was very similar for me. Basically, it didn't seem possible to apply the very important elements of scaffolding online, particularly, because face-to-face, there's detailed interaction between teacher and student. That took much longer online, and there were questions that would arise that couldn't be answered thoroughly. So, it was not possible to monitor my students closely online as well, which was a pity. And so based on our discussion today and just from our brief research, we did have some recommendations. The first one was that, we would recommend that there would be more online support for students and teachers so that there would be more effective teaching and learning on the whole. Gina, did you want to detail the rest of this one?
Yeah, so we also felt that the teaching staff needed to be trained in the technology. When we went into the COVID lockdown period, we literally had 1 week to get abreast with the technology, to sort of become experts ourselves and be able to then teach the students how to use that technology to have the class in the following week. And, it was just thrown on us and we had to go with it. And it was a very stressful moment. And a lot of people ended up just sticking to the basic functions of the technology instead of being creative and expanding it. So if we were trained in advance or given proper training, I think we can be more creative with how online can work for us. Customizing the teaching materials, you can't translate traditional face-to-face content directly to online teaching environments. It doesn't work that way. Some of it can. I think majority of it can be used almost directly, but there is some customization that has to happen. And finally, we also need to teach the staff how to deliver online materials to the students, because again, you don't do it the same way as you would do face-to-face. A lot of things like non-verbal cues that we take for granted face-to-face, online we have to get that information in some other way. So getting them used to that kind of environment will be very helpful. Annabeth?
Yes, thank you, Gina. So just to sum up, today we were discussing with you guys our experiences with applying scaffolding, modeling, and student-centeredness face-to-face, and then with a switch to the online mode after the COVID pandemic started. We also did a little bit of a literature review on Vygotskian philosophy, and came to some summative conclusions after our reflections. Thank you everyone for listening to our discussion, and are we now going to be looking at another talk? These are our references here. Are we fielding questions now, Gina? Do you know, or are we listening to Pamela?
I'm not sure.
Fatme?
Fatme?
Fatme's just gone out of the room. She was here a minute ago, and she just stepped out. Hi, Pamela. Are we listening to you now?
Hello. I think so. I think we were doing questions at the end.
Okay,
All right.
sure, yeah. So
Thank you, everyone.
I think, but I'm not in charge, so I don't know.
Yeah. So shall we just listen to you first and then do the questions after?
Or, okay.
Yeah.
Let's do that. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen.
Now, what do I do with mine? I just leave it here and then you can share yours, yeah?
Let's see. Are you sharing yours now?
No, I'm trying to, what shall I do with mine? Shall I, how do I take my slides out? Do you know?
I don't, but let me just try sharing my screen and I'll see if it takes over.
Oh, it does, I think. Yes, it
That
does.
works.
Yes?
Yeah.
Yeah, that works.
That works.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can see my slides.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. All right. So let me just take a minute to introduce myself and say thanks to everybody for your interest in this topic. So my name is Pam Millett. I'm an associate professor and also an audiologist in the Deaf and Hard of Hearing education program at York. So we are the only program in Ontario that trains teachers to be teachers of the deaf. There are 3 programs in Canada. We're the largest. So as you can imagine, as the Deaf and Hard of Hearing education program, we do a lot of captioning in our program. We have for years. But even for us, what we found during the pandemic is that our use of captioning has just skyrocketed over the past 15 months for a couple of reasons. And so what we found is we're basically doing a version of what I think everybody else is doing is for our classes is a combination of synchronous Zoom and asynchronous online learning activities of a variety of kinds. What we found is that we do have a number of students in our program who have hearing loss. And we found that those students are really struggling a lot more on Zoom than they would face-to-face. And so we've needed to provide captioning a whole lot more on Zoom for students who would have been fine face-to-face without captioning, because the audio and the video quality of platforms like Zoom is so variable. People's dogs are barking in the background, and people's video is glitchy, so you can't lip read, that kind of thing. So we use real-time captioning for that. I'll talk about that in a minute, but basically we have a real person during our synchronous Zoom who is captioning as we go. We also have a lot of asynchronous kinds of materials. What we find in our program is that everything that we put up in front of a student has to be captioned. Both because we have students who need it and also because we want to model best practice for them. So I can't just use kind of a random YouTube clip from somewhere unless it's perfectly captioned. And so we found ourselves creating a lot of our own materials. So doing, and I mean, it's easy to do. You use your camera and you can do like a 20-minute tutorial or a lecture for the students to watch afterwards on a particular topic. So I can do kind of a lecture that way, and then we can have more discussion during the synchronous Zoom, which works really well. But of course, anything I create has to be captioned. And so we've been learning this year how to basically do our own captioning with the kind of technology that's available. To be able to caption that material and make it accessible. And so obviously, caption's helpful for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, whether they use technology like hearing aids or cochlear implants, and they miss pieces and they need that captioning as backup. Students who sign and don't use amplification need the captions unless they have an interpreter. I've always known that there's quite a large and very interesting research, though, on using captions for English language learners. And what I really mean, I know that's not exactly the right term. What I really mean is anyone who's learning a new language, whether that's English or not. Learning a new language, there's a really large literature on the use of captions for that. I was aware of that research, but I've become much more interested in it these days because I'm doing so much more work in captioning. So the methodology for this paper is kind of an integrative literature review, which is really another way of saying taking literature from a variety of different areas and pulling them together to come up with maybe some new ideas or a new theoretical framework, a new perspective on things. And so what I'm doing in this paper is kind of integrating the research literature that exists on captioning as a strategy for new language learners and what that looks like, with the research that I've been doing on automated speech-to-text captioning, the kind of software that's now available, how accurate that is. So integrating these two kinds of literature to see if captioning is a strategy that we could be using more to support new language learners. And so my research questions are not so much, is captioning an effective strategy, because there is a whole really surprisingly large body of research going back to the early 1990s demonstrating that captioning is an effective strategy to support language learning. That's not really my research question. I think that's been proven. More, does this new technology that we now have available to us through apps and software allow us to expand using this strategy for English language teachers? So can English language teachers use this technology in their day-to-day teaching? For us, when we recommend for a deaf or hard of hearing student, please use materials or videos that are captioned, we would never expect a teacher or an instructor to actually know how to caption something. They're having to use whatever is captioned. But I think there's ways that we can expand this given the new kind of technology that we now have access to. And so really the literature is so large, I'm not really going to summarize too much of it here, but it's basically based on the multimedia principle, which is quite simple, that if you can see and hear information at the same time, that supports your learning and your understanding and your remembering. So listening to the language and seeing the language in print at the same time is supportive of language learning. And certainly when we're teaching new language learners, we often do use video as a way to practice, listening to authentic language. So video is used a lot in English language teaching. So what the literature really says around supporting English language learning is that captions help with form meaning mapping, and what that really means is it helps with vocabulary learning, it helps with learning the grammar of the new language, and it also helps with putting all of that together in learning a new language. Captions help learners remember the words better, so partly vocabulary, but also learning grammar. And they're particularly helpful when listeners are uncertain. So if they're listening to a conversation, say, in the language that they're learning, and they're struggling a bit, they're not sure, captions are particularly helpful for those kinds of situations and those kinds of learners. So just to clarify a bit for you what I'm talking about in terms of types of captioning, because there's really two. One is real-time captioning, which is someone listening and typing out the captions at the same time. And so if you've ever watched a live news on television and there are captions, that would have been a real-time captionist. In this kind of situation where we're all together here, what that would look like is I would book a captionist, he or she would log into the meeting, and then they would be typing the captions for everything that is said during the meeting at the time. It works really, really well for certain situations. It's not feasible for pre-recorded material. So that's really not what I'm talking about in this talk. I'm really focusing more on post-production captioning, which is having a video and then adding captions to it. It's the most accurate kind of captioning because it's usually done by a real person. who catches all of the errors, all of the grammar errors and the spelling errors. So if you watched a pre-recorded television show or a movie and you turn the captions on, that's post-production. Someone has done it afterwards. So works well for that, but it's not feasible for live situations. So you'd need something different in a Teams or a live Zoom meeting. So I think what's important to remember when we look at the research on using captions with English language learners is that that research was all done using perfect captions. So someone took a piece of video and captioned it perfectly, so there are no errors. Usually those videos were, fairly short, focused on a really particular concept, like, ordering a meal in a restaurant, that kind of thing. Some of the newer studies in captioning for English language learners are looking at more natural situations, like if you were to watch a television show outside of the academic learning context, and you turned on the captions, does that support learning the new language as well? But essentially, up until now, if teachers wanted to implement this strategy of using captions for English language learners, they were really limited to the material that was already captioned. So you had to go find something that was already captioned. What we have now is automated speech-to-text captioning, where we have computer software doing that job. So a lot of the platforms now, Zoom, Teams, Google Meet, all have automated real-time captioning, which frankly, based on my research, is not brilliant. If you've ever turned it on, it really varies. I don't recommend it for my own students. But you can also use it for things like post-production captioning. So if you turn on the captioning on YouTube, that's automated captioning. That's the software doing the captioning for you. Ever since Apple latched onto this idea of speech recognition software with Siri, it's just exploded. And so we've been, playing around with speech-to-text captioning since the 80s probably, but only when it became sort of adopted by Apple using Siri has it really exploded. So it's way more expensive, way less expensive than paying a person. It's easy to use, but the accuracy is really variable. It's improving, but it's really variable to have a machine or a computer caption your material. And so I've been doing some research in this area, because if we're going to suggest that teachers adopt captioning as a support for their English language learners, it has to be easy to use, and for sure it has to be accurate. And this is some research that I've just published on the accuracy of automated captioning. So for YouTube, for Google Slides, for Stream, which is a video platform in Office 365. If you have Office 365 yourself and you click up on the corner, along with OneDrive and Word and all of those things, you'll find a video platform called Stream, and a free app called Otter. So they vary a bit, but pretty good. I'm just finishing up a follow-up study now, looking at some other platforms. So Stream, again, 98.6% accurate. Otter is a bit better, 99.4%. Google Slides has improved a lot, 98.7% accuracy. And so the accuracy of this automated captioning is getting better and better every day. I think it's got to the point where we can start thinking about suggesting this as a strategy to support English language learning. So just to give you a sense of what that looks like, this is what it looks like in Stream. So I can use my phone and record myself doing a little video. I can upload the video to Stream. I click on auto-generate captions, and it will caption it for me. So I have a transcript along the right-hand side, which I can edit, and the captions show up here in the middle of the screen at the bottom, which is sort of where they belong. So I can do my own captions for my own materials. It's very simple and very accurate. Otter looks a little bit different, but it's the same sort of idea. So Otter is a free app. There's a paid subscription, which is not very expensive for some advanced features. But essentially, I can upload my video to Otter, and it will give me a very accurate transcript. So again, I can do it myself captions for my own material. So I can create things for my students and also use this captioning as a strategy, either for access or to support English language learners. So what I'm sort of finding between my looking at the research that's already there on supporting English language learners and the the research that I'm doing on captioning is that I would say at this point, it's not accurate enough to recommend it for live classes like a live Zoom. It's just there's too many errors on it. But the accuracy is really very, very good, again, depending on the audio quality for pre-recorded lectures. So that's what we've been doing in our program for the last 15 months, is creating our own materials and captioning them ourselves. They're easy to edit, it's easy to do. So we're certainly using it as a strategy for our deaf and hard of hearing students. I think that it's a really interesting strategy for English language teachers to explore, to be able to use this strategy, which has been shown to be effective for English language learners, and use it in their sort of everyday teaching or everyday practice. So future directions, I think I would like to add one more piece. I suspect that adding captions during a live Zoom class would also be supportive for English language learners. I think at this point, the accuracy of automated captioning is not there to suggest that. If we're trying to help people learn a new language, then we need to have an accurate language model in front of them. It's not going to be helpful for them to be looking at an incorrect model of English. But when it gets better, I think this is an interesting piece to add, because my own field of audiology actually has a research literature which suggests that non-native speakers of a language have more difficulty with speech perception under adverse listening conditions. So what that means is listening in background noise, for example, a non-native speaker of the language will struggle more to understand what's going on in background noise than native speakers of the language. And that makes sense, right? So everyone has difficulty in noise. If you also are not a strong user of the language and you're missing things, you're going to struggle even more. So noise just compounds the problem. And so I think it's at some point when the accuracy gets better for live captioning, it'll be interesting to look at the use of captioning in a live class as well. So thank you for listening. Just to finish off, because I do talk a lot about what is good automated captioning and what is bad automated captioning. This is clearly bad automated captioning. This is not what we're looking for. But because the changes in the technology, the accuracy is much, much better. But not to say that this kind of silliness doesn't still show up with automated captioning. So, so it's important to always be aware of that. So thank you.
Thank you, Pam. That's very interesting. Very, very interesting. I used to be an English language teacher before I started teaching at university. And I didn't realize that the captioning technology is very advanced already. That's great.
It's very, very advanced, actually. Surprisingly, the last, and really within the last, I would say maybe 2 or 3 years, it's really started to change.
And is your technology in Canada ahead of what we have in Australia? Do you know?
It's just internet captioning, so it would be the same.
All right.
As far as I know, so as far as I know, things like Zoom or Stream would be the same in Australia as they are in Canada.
So I presume that some of the English language teachers now would be using captioning as a way of teaching their students, right? Not just
Yeah, I don't know to what extent people are actually using this captioning, but I think they could be using it more now that we have the technology. To do it. I think it's an interesting application of the technology that I haven't used up until now, so I'm interested in exploring it.
And what is the proportion of the students that that you're servicing with the technology in comparison to just the average students like in your university?
In our program, we have a larger percentage of students who have a hearing loss.
Yeah.
Because if you were a person who grew up with hearing loss, you could imagine that being a teacher of the deaf is a profession that might interest you. So we tend to have a fair number of students in our program learning to be teachers of the deaf who have a hearing loss themselves.
All right.
So we probably have more students than usual. But we also have students who are not native speakers of English. We have students who are both, who have a hearing loss and have English as a second or a third language. So we use captioning very extensively in our program.
Oh yeah, because there's one here among us. Sorry, I don't know her name or his name. It's I can only see the initials AW, and she says she's hearing impaired. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so see, there's a question in the chat room.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know why there's reluctance. I think some of it is that people just don't think about it. People don't know about it. So people who are hosting a Zoom meeting, for example, don't necessarily know that you can enable the auto captions. They're not always that accurate. So it's really hit and miss in a live Zoom class, whether captioning even is accurate enough to make sense. I think a lot of it is just people don't know much about it. It's not something that they think about it because it's, I think the pandemic has really brought more attention to the issue, because people who have a hearing loss, in my experience, have so much more trouble on Zoom than they do face to face.
Right. That would be a big problem. I think. Gina is typing something. Yeah.
I'm wondering if it's because there's an expectation that people should have a general command of the language. Are you thinking non-native speakers of English, or were you thinking more of students with hearing loss?
I was thinking of people who learn it as a second language, because I notice a lot of the ones that I come across, they don't want to prompt them too much. And they think by not captioning things, they can actually force them to learn faster or better. But I think you need to use a combination that's going to work probably more effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's gotten to the point where it's so available, on YouTube captioning, for example. It's super easy to just click the CC button on a YouTube clip and have captioning available. It's so much more available than it used to be that I think it's worth exploring as a strategy for sure. Because I think even if you have a good command of the language, if you are taking a class, for example, that's a little more technical or a little bit outside of your your usual experience, then you might struggle a little bit more, even if you are a competent or a fluent user of the language. Okay. Oh, sorry, question from Alex. Have you compare the accuracy? Yes, I actually have. I'm just finishing. I did a study previously, which if you email me, I can send you to the article. I just did a follow-up because it changes so fast that you have to keep remeasuring. And I have also found the study that I just did, actually Google was a bit more accurate than Teams and then Zoom. Zoom's a bit glitchy with its captions. So that's interesting that you've noticed that too, because I did find when I measured it, percentage-wise, that Google actually was a little bit more accurate than the other live. So question, how well do these captioning functions work for an instructor who has an accent? Not very well. That's the trouble. That's the trouble with using it in live situations. It depends, because automated captioning relies on good audio quality. So if it's glitchy or there's noise in the background, it won't be as accurate. And it also relies on what it thinks is standard English pronunciation. So in its little, software brain, it has a template of what is standard English pronunciation, and that's what it's listening for. So if you speak with non-standard English pronunciation, the software is not going to caption nearly as well. So it still has a ways to go to be used for live situations. But for pre-recorded materials, even if you had an accent, I think you can run, you can try the automated software, something like Otter, and then you can edit it yourself. It depends on whether that's worth your time in terms of how accurate it is. If it only has a few errors, it doesn't take that long to edit. If there's a lot of errors, then it's a fairly time-consuming thing to fix the captions afterwards.
And Pam, just wondered, because I with this standard accent or standard pronunciation, because I used to be an IELTS examiner and a Cambridge exams examiner, and it always used to strike me as a little bit confusing as what would be standard pronunciation, because you have the American style, then you have the British. So what would be, in your research, what have you found considered a standard?
What the automated captioning thinks is standard is kind of is American. Is a kind of is a really kind of neutral American, and it's a bit, yeah, it's not based, it's based on a very kind of restricted version of what is standard English pronunciation, but it is, right? So if you sound like that, then it will be very accurate. If your pronunciation doesn't sound like what the software thinks is standard English pronunciation, then it won't be as accurate. It'll struggle more, which is why in our program we use live people to caption in a live situation, because they're much better at understanding accents than computers are.
I thought Elaine Koo had another question, but yeah, I think she's decided not to ask the question. Yeah. I might Pam, if you don't mind, I thank you so much. Thank you. That was so interesting. I might leave here now because it's 1:30 in the morning here in Western Australia.
Yeah.
And I have to get some sleep and go back to work.
Of course.
That was a very interesting presentation. Thank you so much. And I'm presuming no one else has any questions for me and Gina. So I'm gonna say goodbye to everyone.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present.
Yes, thank you so much. Have a good day, Pam, and have a good day to everyone.
Good night or good morning.
Good morning. Yeah.